our former president would tweet and talk about, coronavirus as being due to something that happened in China, and he made these racial epithets about it. So he tweeted such as this: last year, China's been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It would work out well, in particular on behalf of the American people. I want to thank President Xi. But then he's also says later, Biden failed badly with the swine flu. It was the game that could not shoot straight. He did not have a clue. We have done an incredible job with the much tougher China virus. And as a result, we can see that over time, these hashtag China virus was tweeted a lot more after President Trump was referring to it. We also know that even if we go back further, there was the whole campaign of the Yellow Peril, in which Asians were depicted as killers, as thieves, as you can see here in this portrayal cartoon that came out of Russia. But then over time, there was this new title, either the model minority, in which it was like, okay, yeah, we would pick them over some of the other ethnic groups because they're safer, they're smarter, based on stereotypes, obviously. And then there was also this term of forever foreigners. So even though you guys are in America, you still hold on to your culture. But of course, all of us should hold on to our culture. So it just shows you some of the ignorance that's been portrayed about Asian Americans and Asian peoples in this country. And then, of course, there's been the ongoing discussion of the relationship between the Asian community and the Black and Hispanic community. So we know that during this whole campaign of Black Lives Matter, there was definitely some solidarity that was occurring. You can see here a sign that says, when Black lives are threatened, all of our lives are threatened. We also know that there were contributions between Asian and Black Hispanic communities during the civil rights movements as well. And I happened to find this by one of our panelists when she was talking to NPR not too long ago, Dr. Kim Tran, in which she was talking about the history of solidarity. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely a good 6-minute listen on NPR from April 2nd, 2021. And then, of course, there's the African presence in Asia. Very often people talk about the slave trade and they only think about the fact that African people were taken to the Americas. But Africans were also taken in a slave trade to across the Indian Ocean to parts of Asia. So these are peoples known as the Sidi people. They're in the Gujarat portion of India. And these are people that that came during the slave trade from countries such as Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, from the East Africa, whereas many of us who are here came from West or Central Africa. Here, this is Sri Lanka, another country we know in Asia, and this was 2017 when they marked the 500-year anniversary of the presence of Africans in Sri Lanka. The Sidi people also can be seen in Pakistan, where they're called the Shidis. And in all of Asia, this is one of the largest groups where you'll find people who are of African descent. And this is Tanzila Kwambrani. She's the first Shidi lawmaker ever in Pakistan. Her family is from Tanzania. So as usual, we want to thank our co-sponsors. We partnered with Hofstra University Public Health Alumni Association. Kerry Myers is president. We'd like to thank Dr. Naomi Maria, Tiffany Harvin, Department of Medicine, Chayor, Aditya Bizanath, our day one audience members. Please follow us on Twitter at Minority Health 3, or you can also follow us on Instagram at minorityhealth.convos. So I would like to introduce our esteemed panel. We first have Dr. Neha Gupta. She's the Division Chief of Integrated Behavioral Health at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, as well as the Medical Director for the Collaborative Care Program at my alma mater for residency, Rush University Medical Center, where she's also an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Internal Medicine. We also have Emmeline Kim, who we'll refer to as Emmy Kim, who is an esteemed member of our community at Northwell. She's an AVP in research compliance as well as a privacy officer. She's a co-chair of our Bridges Business Employee Research Group, and she's the co-creator of the Asian Business Employee Research Group. And last but not least, as mentioned earlier, we also have the pleasure of having Dr. Kim Tran, who has her PhD in ethnic studies from the University of California, Berkeley. She's also a researcher in Asian American solidarity with the Black Lives Movement and does a lot of amazing work in the area of diversity, inclusion, and equity, where she serves as a consultant focusing on allyship, LGBTQIA community issues, as well as racial equity. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Maya Williams for tonight's show.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. I'd first like to start with Emmeline. Your father migrated to the United States from during the 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement. Can you tell us his story?
Yeah, sure I would. And I'm honored to, in honor of AAPI Heritage Month, actually. So my father actually started opening up and talking to me more about his immigration and the time that he spent here, initially. And we kind of did this exercise where we layered the social political movements, on top of his immigration. It was really interesting, and it really got him to open his eyes up to, the critical aspects of politics and social movements that were happening at the time. But I think before I kind of delve into that, just wanted to mention that, I think it's important for us to also think about the long history of laws in the US, right? When we think about immigration, right? It's controlled a lot by these laws. And these laws in the US, for a long time have really banned people from Asia, Mexico, Africa, and other countries from immigrating here. For a variety of different reasons. There was the Immigration Act of 1924, which came after the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s. The Asian Exclusion Act created quotas that banned Asians, Indians, Arabs, because we were seen as the yellow peril. And there were also US policies that denied citizenship to people of African descent whose ancestors were enslaved, denied voting and labor rights, forced into segregated facilities. But with the civil rights movement, that's what we really talked about, right? In the 60s, that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it also led the US to open its doors to immigrants, right? And traditionally, US immigration laws restricted people from other parts of the world, such as Asia and Africa. The civil rights movement was really instrumental and prompted Lyndon B. Johnson to sign legislation called the Immigration and Nationality Act, or the Hart-Celler Act, into law in 1965 at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. And this ended discriminatory laws against Asians and Africans, and also allowed for family reunification that benefited other American communities, such as Italians, Greeks, and Portuguese, while it restricted Mexicans and other groups. But when we talked about this, I was like, Dad, this is how you're able to come to the United States, right? It was because of this law, but that's also how my father was able to immigrate. It was also due to a shortage of healthcare providers that were working in the US, especially in the urban and rural areas. And so he came to the country in 1968 to train at a hospital in Chicago. And he would tell me these stories about, just how rough it was, because due to the shortage, right, and also being an immigrant, when you're on call at the hospital, you're basically in charge of the entire hospital because there weren't enough staff. You start working at 8 a.m. till 8 a.m. the next day. Then you have to do another standard 8-hour shift on top of that. There weren't a lot of laws in place to prevent exploitation, right, of immigrant workers at the time. But after his residency, he got his license, more laws kind of changed, which allowed him to continue to stay here. He opened up clinics in the north and west sides of Chicago, the areas of Halsted, Cicero, Madison, that also serve Black communities. And the west side of Chicago can be a little rough. He was held up by gunpoint a number of times. But he also talked about the conditions of the city of Chicago and the disproportionate impact on the Black community, which was a result of years of redlining and discriminatory housing practices. But as you can see, as like an immigrant, right, like these experiences and what he saw in the environment shaped his views of the Black community. But that's why it's important to understand the root causes and have these conversations. The last thing I'm just going to mention is, there's this really great book I'm reading called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it really goes into all of these, these laws that have created, a segregated America by our government. So I just want to throw that out there, but it's really super interesting and something to really pay attention to, and really also embed in conversations that we're having with our family.
Thank you. And I'm very happy that you mentioned the plight of immigrants. And we could clearly see this happening today. And so this question is for Dr. Kim. Asian immigrants and Asian Americans have often been referred to as the model minority. Can you explain what is the model minority and how this can negatively affect the perception that AAPI individuals do not experience discrimination in the workplace and society, particularly now with the increase in hate crimes?
By Dr. Kim, were you referring to me?
Yes.
Okay. So the model minority, in a quick sum up, is this very straightforward idea that Asian Americans are culturally and sometimes biologically predisposed to economic, academic, and social success, right? So it's this idea that if you're born Asian, specifically if you're born probably East or Southeast or maybe even South Asian, that you're going to do well in school, you're going to do well in the job market, you're going to do well in the academic sphere. The issue with the model minority is that it's extremely divisive and it's completely inaccurate. So the model minority was developed post-World War II in order to keep Asian Americans safe. We've seen this long, and Emmy was kind of drawing on this a little bit earlier. We've seen this long history of Asian American exclusion at the policy level, at the social level, things like don't go to Chinatown, it's dirty, MSG is bad for you, and at the individual level. So for Asian Americans, Asian women are the most likely to marry outside of their race, right? So that's those three levels of marginalization. The model minority thing kind of works as a wedge. It says Asian Americans are better than other communities of color, like Black folks, like Latinx folks, like Indigenous folks. And we're honorary kind of white in that mix, right? And it's fundamentally anti-Black. Now, anti-Blackness didn't begin in the Asian American community, but the model minority mythology, that stereotype, relies on anti-Blackness. And the model minority myth was meant to keep Asian Americans from ever being interned again. It's meant to keep Asian Americans safe from this idea that we will bring pestilence and disease. And I can count all of the laws and all of the massacres in America where this has been an ongoing idea, right? So the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the Page Act, we saw a revisitation of the Page Act with the Atlanta shooting. Right, this idea that Asian women are sex workers, that they're fundamentally unclean, this particular kind of idea. And the model minority kind of creates this false notion that we're honorary white, so that people like the women who are killed in Atlanta get completely erased. People like me get completely erased. Vietnamese women experience the exact same pay gap as Black women, right? So Southeast Asian men, a couple of weeks ago, President Biden deported 33 Southeast Vietnamese men specifically. And we didn't hear about it on the news. But my community, the folks that I am a community organizer with, including my mom, were really interested and committed to keeping that plane grounded because our community was on that plane. My mom knew a couple of the men who were formerly incarcerated on that plane. So it's completely inaccurate. It's really comforting. That's the problem. It feels really good, right? And sometimes it feels true. South Asian women out-earn white men. East Asian women, a lot of East Asian women out-earn white men. So it feels true, right? Because we cherry pick our facts. If we look at Burmese women make less money than Black women in America. Latinx women, like there are all of these nuances and gaps, right? But the model minority myth is pervasive, it feels really nice, and it's extremely popular.
Thank you. And that's important and that's the thing about, stereotypes at the end of the day. Not all stereotypes are true, but we all know confirmation bias, and sometimes people look for the confirmation bias to make it appear true. And this question, yeah.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
The last thing is that stereotypes don't like the importance behind stereotypes is that there's evaluation of stereotypes, right? So the model minority thing is important and a stereotype to the extent that it naturalizes the kind of oppression that Asian Americans experience, in the same way that anti-Blackness naturalizes the kind of oppression that Black Americans and African diasporic folks experience in America, right? So if people are keep saying that the stereotype is that you're angry or that you're passive, well then for Asian women in the workplace, it makes sense that you wouldn't get promoted because you don't have leadership potential. And for Black folks, it would make sense that the police would stop you a ton more in the city of New York because you're aggressive. So stereotypes function to cover up the fact that oppression exists, right? It makes it normal.
Thank you. And that's a very important point. I'd like to now ask Neha, speaking of stereotypes, and after 9/11, there was an increase in hate crimes towards the Sikh and Muslim communities. How did this impact your community, and how has it continued to impact your community 20 years later?
Yeah, I was in college at the time, so I'm not sure I really understood the magnitude of how much it's affecting my community back then, but I can say that 20 years later, it's forced us to think about parts of our life and how we look and how we act and how we are in a way that we just never were raised to think about. So, it's just made us fear being marginalized in just day-to-day life. So for example, my husband he also is in healthcare, but he has long hair and has a little bit of a beard. And in the past couple years, I've actually kind of told him he had to shave his beard, and I was very scared for him to get on a plane. And it's like, why am I thinking this way? Like, I never grew up thinking that way. And so it's just really opened up our eyes to a level of stress that we just never imagined. And, and I think it does all group together with the Sikh and the Muslim communities, the Hindu communities. It's just that it's just painted this picture of ignorance that we truly was completely foreign to us. And that's the genuine sentiment I personally felt. And I've had to encourage myself to work through that anxiety and just get through the moment or the flight or whatever it is, and realize that we got through one before and now we'll get through another one and another one. And that's sort of how we've coped.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Emmeline, often we think of the civil rights movement's impact on Black and Brown communities. What was the impact of the civil rights movement on the AAPI communities during the 1960s?
Yeah, so there was a tremendous amount of impact from the civil rights movement. It led to the Asian American movement called, that people refer to as Yellow Power in the 60s and 70s. Activists really advocated for so many different things. For example, ethnic studies. There are so many students that were advocating for expansion of ethnic studies in many universities. People were advocating for reparations for Japanese Americans who were forced into internment camps during World War II. And by the way, there was a regiment of Japanese Americans who fought in the war and were also involved in liberating concentration camps and subcamps in Germany. You don't often hear about it, but it happened. Also advocating for an end to the Vietnam War. But keep in mind that these were things that the Black community similarly advocated for. The civil rights movement exposed systemic institutional racism and oppression, and that really resonated with the Asian American community because it also made them reflect about how they were also discriminated against and oppressed. And there's also a lot of solidarity, back in the day too, and also sharing of philosophies and thoughts. Black activists were also influenced by Chinese politics and revolutionary history. But this led to the identity of Asian American. It started there. rather than being referred to as Orientals. But I think the complication is that there are so many ethnic groups represented under the Asian umbrella. And in hopes of trying to be more inclusive and as a political identity, it was brought into AAPI, which we know more commonly as Asian American Pacific Islander. But even within that, right, it's still so diverse within the umbrella. So eventually these actions led to President Ford in 1976 declaring that the Executive Order 9066, which ordered the incarceration of Japanese Americans, as a mistake, and Reagan signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that gave $20,000 in reparations to surviving internees with an apology from the government. And it did lead to more robust ethnic study programs today at a lot of different universities. And the work is still continuing today. In fact, if you look at the history of activists, Black activists also taught the AAPI Canadian activists how to effectively protest and also join them, right? So there are a lot of acts of solidarity, but there is huge impact as a result of the civil rights movement, for sure, on AAPI communities.
Thank you. And now, just to tie this in, this question is for Kim. How did the concept of anti-Blackness originate in the AAPI community?
I want to be really clear here because it didn't. So anti-Blackness is a feature of the model minority myth, but it is not, like, the model minority myth did not birth anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is actually one of the few racial universals. Right. So while we see a strong reliance on anti-Blackness within the model minority myth, it definitely didn't originate within the community. So the model, one of the key pieces of the model minority myth is actually that it depends on Asian Americans being able to see themselves and be socially positioned and structurally positioned as better and above Black folks. But that idea did not originate within the Asian American community. There is a really deep narrative of hostility between Asian and Black communities in America. And I think a lot of folks want to look at Los Angeles uprisings in 1992 around Rodney King to say, look at how hard that relationship is, right? Like, look at what happened in Koreatown when Black folks were kind of resisting the police brutality that happened to Rodney King. And that kind of idea that Asian Americans and Black folks are kind of against each other in perpetuity is inaccurate, because you go all the way back to 1955 and you saw the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, where Black folks and Asian folks came together and said, we're both really impacted by colonialism. What are we going to do? How are we going to get out of here? Right. And you can bring that up through the 60s, where Emma Gee and Yuji Ichioka developed this terminology of Asian American to talk about people who were standing in solidarity with racial justice at the time. Right. And then you see it again over and over again. You see Asian Americans and Black folks fighting the Klan in the South. You see Vietnamese and Black folks rebuilding in post-Katrina New Orleans together. And then in 2014, 2015, you see Asians for Black Lives. So this idea that anti-Blackness is fundamental to Asian American society and Asian American culture is untrue. And also it creates this false narrative that we don't do racial justice work together. Ethnic Studies was formed by a coalition of Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, and Black folks, right? You don't get Black studies in California without Asian Americans in large part. We're doing this together. So I want to be really cognizant of that there's a really strong relationship of solidarity between these two communities, regardless and irrespective of this really popular, insidious narrative that we are antagonistic toward each other.
Thank you. And thank you for clarifying that, because that is something that a lot of people have the notion about. And it's just that minorities cannot get together to work together. And it's like we have this common enemy that we have to fight. But instead of fighting the common enemy, we're fighting each other. So that's sort of like a distraction. And so it's good to always show people that whatever the media portrays, that there's no Asian for Black lives or Black lives for Asian lives, that's not a thing, that we're always constantly working together, and we're always like, we are a team, and we all, like I always say, like, we're all in the struggle together.
Yeah, and there are like Daryl Mieta is a scholar of Asian American studies, and he says that the thing that differentiates Asian American movements is that they are the most coalitionary formation of any racial justice movement, and that's true across time, right? When Malcolm X was dying, it was Yuri Kochiyama who was holding him as he died. So we have to keep in mind that our histories are entangled. We understand that racial justice is a common goal. And what you see, the complete erasure of people like Yuri Kochiyama, the complete erasure of things like Asians for Black Lives, is a byproduct, again, of this idea that Asian Americans are apolitical, inactive, passive, and submissive. It's a reflection of that stereotype.
Yes, so it seems like everything keeps coming back to the stereotypes, which leads me now to my question for Neha, is that the uptick of violence in the AAPI community can lead to an understandable increase in anxiety. How can people cope with these feelings?
Yeah, I think it's important to, what you're asking here, I think is, really asking the question of, how do you manage triggers and focuses of anxiety? So I would say it's really important to practice some of the basic principles of cognitive behavioral therapy in those scenarios. So, and that's a fancy term that is used in a lot of religions, faiths, just even friendship. I mean, it's just a way of thinking that the idea is that you have a pattern of thoughts, which lead to a feeling, which leads to an action or behavior. So this circuit sort of starts with an automatic negative thought, typically, so when you mentioned that increase in anxiety, a scenario could be, okay, well, I'm walking down the street and this is the time of a lot of violence, that person must be thinking, I really want to harm her. And how, and then kind of ask yourself, how is that making you feel? What's that emotion you're feeling right now? And that thought might be, I'm really scared. And then from that feeling of being scared, what's the action or behavior that's going to come from that? And it would be, I'm just going to stay in my car. I'm going to go home. I'm going to isolate myself. So I think understanding that pattern and knowing that it's going to be really important to change those initial thoughts. It within reason, keeping yourself safe and that's important, but really challenging yourself and starting to practice that, so what is the evidence behind that person thinking that of me, trying to understand the mind reading that can take place, to kind of also help to bring yourself back to earth in the sense of, am I really in harm's way right now, and trying to bring yourself to a little more evidence around yourself and to bring yourself to a place of reality too. And these feelings are real, but I think, and I do go through it personally, and I have to practice these things because you got to be able to walk to your car. You have to be able to live your life. So these are just some basic tools. And I think this goes along with some of the other questions you have for me too, is that it's really important to try to challenge for alternate ways of thinking to get yourself through those emotions and the behavior.
Thank you. And I just have a follow-up question to that, because it's like now the world is opening back and people have all of those anxious feelings with going out with COVID-19. How do you, it's like vaccinated versus non-vaccinated, and that question can also be for Kim as well, because, working with organizations, like how do organizations deal with the anxiety that individuals face with going back to work in COVID-19 with all the social injustice issues that we have going on? Like, what should organizations do to be able to manage that? And what can employees do to be able to manage the anxiety as well around that?
Neha, do you want to take a stab at it first? You can.
I guess I would challenge that and say that it's respectfully, I think part of the problem is that we're just that we are assuming that there's a marginalization going on with people going back to work. I think that we have to just treat everybody the same and understand the science of COVID, you know. So if communities are going back to work, it's everybody. And if we tell ourselves, at least this is what kind of gets me through even my kids going to school, is, you know, if we're practicing guidelines from the CDC, we're wearing our masks, we're keeping that distance, we're washing our hands, there's truth behind those protocols, and just trusting in the in the CDC. I mean, I don't know, I guess that's my way of just saying that I think sometimes when we inflame the anxiety around this, it can actually make us stressed about things that we didn't even think about before. So I don't know. That's just my initial take.
So I think I'm going to come at this slightly differently, because I hear two different things in your question, Maya. And the first piece is, what do we do around our anxiety when it comes to presenting as East Asian and moving in the world at the grocery store? And I want to say East Asian specifically because we're looking at xenophobia. We're not looking at like pan-Asian incidents of violence. We're looking at people who look explicitly one way, right? So that's one part of your question. I think the other part is, what do we do around that anxiety when it comes to very real fear, material fear for folks in going back to work, and simultaneously also dealing with these incidents of anti-Asian violence? And so the first piece is, I love Neha's advice or answer to his question, which was, you got to tap into what's happening for you. I just did a bystander intervention training for 100 youth across the country, and I thought it was so exciting that they came to this session. I will also say that one of the biggest failings of the vast majority of bystander interventions is that they don't address the reality that trauma comes up for people. Their own anxieties get in the way, and then they're like wrapped up in their own stuff. Right. So one of the things that I would really encourage folks to do is ground themselves in their own reaction. So assess what's happening for you. Are you losing focus? Are you like, actually look at what's happening, right? Is there someone who's afraid? You got to read the body language. And then you got to figure out, am I afraid? Is my heart beating faster? Is my breath coming faster? And that means try to focus on something nearby. Grab your keys in your hands and ground dig your heels into the ground, right? Because there's no sense in intervening if you're going to lose it, right? So one part is, you got to deal with the reality of who you are and how you're experiencing it. And I think in terms of the COVID piece and how you engage with, I'll talk specifically to my own equity practice. There are specific ways that if you are in an organization, you can support people through things like anti-Asian violence and COVID fear, right? And one of them is, if there is yet another viral video of a Black person or an Asian person experiencing violence, that's a great time to train your managers on how to talk to folks about this. It's a great time to make deadlines and everything really flexible, because this stuff is in the water. It's on Twitter, it's on Facebook, it's on WhatsApp. You're going to want to give people the option to say, I'm done for the day. Right? And then you're going to want, as an organization, to be able to back that up in some way, shape, or form. Do you have an equitable workplace? And that isn't just, do people of color get hired here? It's, do people of color feel like they're valued here? And do we actually know how to combat different stereotypes in a way that is cognizant of how they're different? Black folks experience very different stereotypes than Asian Americans. I don't get badged by security, but a Black person at my workplace probably isn't get told they don't speak up all the time either.
Mhm. That's a very good point. I was at a friend's wedding and I was talking to a woman who was Asian American, and we were talking about our differences when we get pulled over by the police. I told her, when I get pulled over, my hands are out the window already with my license and registration. She said, you know what? I never thought about having to do that. I just can reach for my purse. I said, yeah, you can, because you're not likely to get shot, whereas I am. So I agree with you 150%.
Yeah.
But again, no one's going to come up to me and say, you gave me COVID, and try to throw acid on my face. So it's not that you're not going to get it. You're just going to get it in a different way.
Yeah. And I've had people, this is the first year of my life where I've had white women like aggressively walk away from me or like pull their jackets up and zip them up. It's brand new. But that feeling actually is a bridge. That's an opportunity for me to understand what it's like to live in a different body,
Mhm.
right? Like I'm from a working class neighborhood with predominantly brown people. I have definitely been pulled over by police. But when I get pulled over by police, I can get really saucy. And that's not going to be dangerous for me. And that means I can also leverage what I look like. I can leverage the body I'm in to do cop watches when I'm in Oakland, right? So if I see a cop stopping a Black person, do I get out and just stand there and record and say, I've got the record app on for the ACLU?
Right.
So like, whatever you're doing, you're going to do, but I'm here and I'm not scared that you're going to do something to me. It's highly unlikely that that person does anything to me.
Right. Very good point. We have a comment from the audience. I don't mean to change gears, but I think this needs to be said. And this was actually something that we wanted to address, but unfortunately, the person that we asked to speak on this wasn't able to attend the show. So when someone from the audience says, interesting how differences between Blacks and Asians are frequently highlighted or in competition. Black and brown versus British Black and Asian. There's a whole group of Black and Asian, sometimes we also say Blasian, mixed, that don't have a seat at the table. They are unseen and unheard and often have unresolved self-identity issues. They are demanded to pick a side they identify more with or are treated by society as one way or the other. Dark-skinned Asians with unknown ancestral origins, Black and Asian mixed parents. They might look Black and be pulled over or have an Asian name and not get hired because of these harmful stereotypes. And this is why I was trying to have this particular person on the show. You would think like she looks just like me and Maya, but then you see her last name and you're like, where's your dad from? Oh, he's from Japan. Okay. But you don't have this stereotypical look. You just look, a certain way because we have ways of saying how we think people look, who looks this way, who looks that way. And she has told me her story of she's treated one way by her Black family and another way by her Asian. Talk about who might be raised by their mother versus who's raised by their father. Because that can always also change things. Because very often, if it's a single parent, it's the mom. So did you grow up with your Black mother or did you grow up with your Asian mother? Because that's probably also going to make this conversation a lot different. So I'll open it up to either you, Kim, or Emmy to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off or to kick us off in this conversation. There are a ton of Black Asian mixed race folks in the world who often don't get included in these conversations. And if you're looking for like notable folks, Don Leon Gardner, who is starring on Ava DuVernay's Queen Sugar. We can look at some folks like Janae Aiko, who's mixed race Black and Asian, right? I think Janae Aiko might be everything but white. So, Janae Aiko is also in that mix. And so when I have mixed feelings about bringing this, but Tyga's Vietnamese and Black. I'm sorry,
but the Black delegation gives Tiger over to you guys.
Oh, boo.
No.
So I think that there are a lot of folks who don't get added to this conversation about race and racial formations with Black and Asian folks because we don't want to see that bridge. Again, it's a byproduct of that antagonism and that hostility, right? Of course, we don't think that there are Black Asian folks because we're not ready to accept the fact that the reality exists that there's a bridge between our communities. And I think that's really, that's a loss for us as a country to be able to have that conversation, right? A conversation about race that doesn't center whiteness in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and I just add that there's not enough conversations about how, the richness, right? When we have, multiple cultures and, even in my home, like we have a multicultural mix and it makes things so fun. And there's just so much to be said about that, so much positivity. But when you look at, the media and everything, it's like Black against white versus Asian. And it's like, there's not enough focus, right? About solidarity, about mixed races, and just how when we do come together, there's a lot of richness in that, right? It's the script is flipped. So I think we do have to talk more about it and recognize that, there's so much more there, right? In terms of our stories. And so I just, it's a lot of what Kim already said, right? About how the mainstream media tends to focus on divisiveness, against the groups. I think we also have to pay attention, like who's telling those stories, right? Like who's editing the paper that's going out to you, or who's editing the news. And, you know, part of it also is supporting people of color, you know, who are writers, who are creating the podcasts, who are creating the movies that bring these perspectives to us, right? Because, you know, I think that's been part of the issue, is that we don't have enough of these perspectives, right? Talking about the mixed cultures. You know, there's so many movies and shows about it, but like, do we really see it, right, in mainstream media? Not really, right? Because it doesn't even get to the point in which it's released on Netflix or released on, you know, TV, right? It doesn't even get there. So I think that's part of the issue, right? Is there's so much filtering, and things don't even get to a point in which all of us can really see these perspectives. So I think that's part of the issue that's been happening for quite some time. And, you know, and we have been seeing a huge movement with people pushing back on this, and really, you know, paying attention to who's directing the films, who's in the films, whose stories are we seeing, whose perspectives. So it's, you know, it's something that we just have to be really cognizant about, you know, as we move forward.
And also that we play these roles, because let's not forget the fact that they used to tape white women's eyes to make them look quote unquote
Yeah,
Asian.
totally.
So, you know, that's the other part of it, is not only are we telling the story, Emmy, but are we using the right representation to tell the story, or are we still whitewashing it?
And
Or
I
Yeah.
having, you know, like Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra. I mean, you know, that's the other part of it too, is making sure that we're represented when these stories are being told.
And I think there's a way that when you look at the growth of Asian American media in the last 5 to 10 years, there is a really strong sense of the model minority myth replaying itself over and over again. Like, I love Mindy Kaling, I loved Mindy Project, but every dude she dated had to be white. Every single one. And also, she's a doctor, and this comes from where Mindy Kaling's from. Like, that show is very, very close to her story as a person. Her parents are doctors. She's from New England, and she has dated white men. But like, I would be thrilled if I could ever see my story. And that's really not going to happen, because the people who we want to platform did not grow up raised by single parents who are kind of hood rats who stole everything before they were 23, right? Like that, no one's interested in that. Like, and then you're gay, it's too much. It's too much. We can't write that story. There's nobody out there who knows how to write that story. There's nobody out there who
Okay,
knows how to
I'd
direct
pay to
that.
see it. I would pay to see it.
Dude, big
I'll
money.
direct it. I'll produce it.
Big
I got
money.
you.
I'll bring Tyga out to say make it rain. I'm interested in representation that's not about reproducing the same kind of model minority story and idea that we have seen for decades. And I'm not seeing that. And
Right.
in such a big way, representation validates that we exist. And right now, it doesn't look like any of us exist, really.
Right. And that ties into a question that I had for you, Kim, which was, how do we tell these stories, or what is the best way to tell us our stories as they lay at the intersection of queerness and Asian American or other person of color that is the representative of who we are as a people, or as.
Yeah. I think when we're talking about Asian American stories, I'm really interested in a specific kind of representation right now. And it is representation that looks kind of nothing like Crazy Rich Asians. Like, I know a lot of y'all were excited about that. I really was not. I could care less. Rich Asian people, crazy rich Asian people, like, no, absolutely not. Light skin, thin, rich Asian people, absolutely not. So I want y'all to start with people you have never seen on a screen. And that means we start with people who experience the intersection of identities: disabled Asian Americans, poor Asian Americans, dark-skinned Dulles Asian Americans, queer and trans Asian Americans. Again, I would love to see my story. Like, my partner and I've been together 5 years. They are a trans masculine, dark-skinned South Asian person. But like, when you look at these stories, is it always going to be about, like, are you reproducing the same thing? And is the same thing that you're reproducing a light-skinned, thin Asian woman in love with a white man? You can step back from that. Trust when I say you can step back from that. Right? So start with folks who you have never seen represented on screen. Start with folks who experience a number of axes of marginalization. Think about, the first thing that comes to mind is, how does intersectionality erase certain identities from this fold? And how do we make them vibrant? How do we make them beautiful? How do we celebrate them and talk about them with nuance?
We have a couple of comments on Facebook that just popped up from this conversation. This is from Isabella. She said, all insightful and accurate points. There should be a social and ethical accountability in the media in inciting divisiveness versus inclusiveness. Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you. And that is so, I think what you said, Kim, is so interesting, because I always tell people that stories, and that's why I advocate for intersectionality. I look like a Black woman, and when I came to America, I was considered an African American, but I consider myself Afro-Caribbean. And so it's not that one day I experience racism and then the other day I experience sexism and then another day it's xenophobia or something along those lines, like all of those identities, and then you don't get to see those identities. And when you see a Caribbean woman on TV, it's usually Jamaican. And we're not only Jamaicans, we have like 28 other countries in the Caribbean, just like, let's make it clear. But to move away from just that, I just want to go back to what you and Emmy was saying a little bit earlier about, like, there is division within our communities. And I want to hear a little bit more about the work that you guys have been doing in that community and how you're helping to bridge the, just to bring these two communities together.
I mean, you can go first. I did my whole spiel, so you can go.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, keep in mind that AAPIs have been supporting BLM movement for years, right? When we talk about it, it's just, the media doesn't focus on, right? Even if you look at Akai Gurley, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, there's always been support and a lot of solidarity events. But, these are things that the media doesn't want to cover. They want to instead focus on divisiveness that keeps that, trope of that Black Asian conflict going, levels of fear going. AAPIs have been prominent among rallies for Black Lives in NYC and, across the country even. And we also have legislators and senators like, John Liu has been calling for Black and Asian unity. So, there's been a lot. And I have to just say personally, my daughter, she's a TikToker, and I always tell them, like, stop TikToking because you TikTok all your time away. It's like a waste of time, but it's really been interesting because when you also look at the younger generation, they're getting a lot of their information about like social and racial justice from these platforms, and they've been doing quite a lot using these platforms. And it's really ignited, a whole new level of advocacy, activism, pro solidarity. You'll see Asians for Black Lives, but it's also really, even for my daughter's generation, really brought a greater level of awareness and acknowledgement of privileges that certain AAPIs have, and also looking at the incomparable violence that Black communities often go through, particularly by law enforcement. And that article that you had sent about racial inequity in fatal US shootings, where they actually collected the data between 2015 to 2020. I mean, that's pretty much data for you, right? That shows the rate of fatal police shootings for Black, Indigenous, and people of color is constant from those years, and BIPOC have significantly higher death rates compared with whites, in the overall victim pool, right? So I think people are able to gather a lot of this data that is coming out. But one of the things I do want to mention too is that because of social media and a lot more data at hand, and just more focus on this treatment of the Black community by law enforcement, you also see splits among the AAPI community that also struggle with saying that increased presence of law enforcement is the answer to anti-Asian violence, because I think there's a greater understanding that that's really not going to be helpful, right? And I think also what happened with George Floyd, there was also a reckoning because, one of the officers who stood by was Asian, right? And, and I do think that really, led to us kind of reflecting on that and also making sure that we're doing work and talking to our family members about it, right? And our elders. We had conversations, I had conversations with my kids, family members about this, about systemic racism, internalized racism. And, one of the movements that I thought was also really nice was, it's called Letters for Black Lives .com. And there are these letters that are in many different languages that help to start the conversation, because I think, one of the challenges too within the Asian community is is the language, right? Because you have generations where maybe my daughter's generation, she's more fluent in English, and talking to the grandparents, they speak predominantly another language. And how do you really speak to your generations about what's going on? And this was kind of a nice way to get that conversation going, or at least send that letter to start talking about this more within families. Because in the Asian families, right, like it may not be a topic that is really talked about as much, but you've seen, much more of this education that's also taking place.
Well, I can't believe how quickly the time has flown. It seems like we just got started. There was so much
I
to
know.
unpackage, and it probably just means we have to do a part 2 because there were so many questions left. And someone in the chat was like, "Y'all need to address it, our people who are mixed." And I think that definitely is something that that's another whole hour and talking about
Mhm.
colorism, which is something I think Kim touched on earlier, because colorism, I think, unfortunately, for all of us that are of ethnic background, is real. I remember one of my med school, she was from friends from med school. Her family was from Afghanistan. They had the same colorism issues that we have, and your community discussing very similar cross-cultural references. I think that we all agree that representation is key for all of us of ethnic groups, that we should be showing different stories. We should be showing African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and we should see them on different levels, whether it's disabilities, LGBTQIA. We need to show representation from all walks of life. And you're right, we do have, unfortunately, very stereotypical images. And as a sidebar about Mindy's brother, when he applied to medical school, he checked off the black box due to the fact, going back to the whole concept of the model minority, he thought it would be easier to get in as a black person because, we don't get into med school. So I have my other issues with Mindy through her brother as well. But definitely this whole concept of us pitting each other against each other definitely does lead to unnecessary marginalization. And we need to come together as communities because, so we have a lot of the similar issues as immigrants who came to this country, whether we came here enslaved or came here by choice. And we need to support each other through all of this violence, whether it be racial violence around COVID or around police brutality and violence. And also, we need to read about our history. I mean, I learned so much reading by doing all this reading myself, and I think we all need to know about our history, because when we go to school in this country, they tell their history, and it's important that we know our own history. And even though there's this whole foreigner thing that they want to call people, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going. So it's important that you understand and you get your history from your people, not the whitewash version, so that you understand the true story, because unfortunately, our stories are not always told in the same way. And we're not a monolithic group of people. So there's a lot of things we've done both there, overseas, and here ourselves as model. And I personally don't even like to call ourselves minority anymore, because we do know that people of color at this point are not the minority in this country anymore. And minority infers that we're less than. So I just think that we're a model group of ethnic people that should be proud of where we come from, that continue to work together to make this country a better place. And with that, I say good night. We'll be back in 2 weeks, in which we'll be talking about COVID. Where are we a year later? Thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. I'm signing off. Dr. Allison Myers, Dr. Maya Williams. Good night. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.